Mideast Realities, a unique half-hour highlighting the real Middle East. It is a program of information that government and media often misrepresent or just don't want you to know. Get the news without bias. Facts without distortion. And most importantly, analysis from the experts. With your host and chairman of the Committee on the Middle East, Mertv Sd. Each week, this program will feature an interview, discussion, or an event to help viewers understand the complex situation in today's Middle East, and especially the realities of U.S. policies toward that crucial region of the world. Mideast Realities.
Welcome to Mideast Realities. I'm your host, Mertv Sd. This week, and for the next few weeks, we'll be bringing you the views of Moshe Ahrens. We do so not because Moshe Ahrens is a favorite of ours, not because we agree with his views, but because he's a very important personality in Israel. Now let me put this in context for you. Moshe Ahrens is once again the defense minister of Israel in the government of Bibi Netanyahu. In the past, he has served as both foreign minister and defense minister. But probably the most important thing he's done for Israel, for the world, in terms of influence, is it was he who spotted Bibi Netanyahu, made him his protege many years ago, brought him into the Israeli government, serving in the foreign ministry, serving at the United Nations, and then he became, of course, the prime minister of Israel. Now, those of you who watch this program regularly know what our views of the Middle East are and the kinds of personalities we like to present. Very independent, very forthright, very honest. Mr. Ahrens did not expect he would be back in government. He thought that he was in retirement. However, he is back. The Israeli elections are coming. It's very likely he and those associated with him will continue to play a very important role in Middle East affairs. And the context of our program is that a number of years ago, our cameras were at a private talk being given by Moshe Ahrens at the Adass Israel Synagogue at a time when he was out of power, at a time when, in fact, the Labor Party was in power in Israel, and at a time when Moshe Ahrens was much more free to speak his mind, much more free to tell us what he really thinks and represents than he is now that once again he holds political power in Israel. So we're going to bring you major excerpts from that talk from a few years ago. At the end of the program, I'll try to put it in perspective again. And also we'll show you a few clips from his son, Yigal Ahrens, who has a very different perspective on these affairs. In fact, it's quite ironic that the defense minister of Israel has a son who teaches computer science in California, a son who by American standards would be considered a draft evader and has refused to serve in the Israeli army and holds diametrically opposed views to those of his father. So, thank you again for watching our program. These are the views of Moshe Ahrens, now once again the defense minister of Israel.
Thank you very much. It is really a pleasure to be with you here tonight. It's almost like homecoming, coming back to Washington after many, many years. I spent a year in the city as Israel's ambassador. I'm always surprised on meeting people who seem to think that I must have been here for 4 or 5, 6 or 7 years. It was only 12 months, but they were a very intense 12 months. It was the period of the war in Lebanon. And those of you whose memory goes back that far will probably recall that during that period I appeared on television here almost every day, and sometimes twice or three times a day. And there's a certain element of nostalgia connected with coming back to the city, in which I spent a memorable year. As you've heard in the introduction, I've done many things in my life. I'm probably on my 7th career at this stage, but I had never written a book. This is the first book I've written. I think it's probably the last book I'm going to write. Because I'm busy doing things, I had never thought that I would end up writing a book, but I wanted to get it out of my system. I thought it was important to tell the story of 4 years, 1988 to 1992, 4 years in which I was Israel's foreign minister and Israel's defense minister. Years that were very eventful, that are important even now when we look back at these years, and there have been many events since then. The title of the book, as I originally envisaged it, was going to be War and Peace in the Middle East, 1988 to 1992. That is the title of the book in Hebrew, Milchama B'Shalom B'Mizrach Tichon, 1988 to 1992. But the American publisher wanted a somewhat zappier title, I guess, and that's how this Broken Covenant title got born. The book, as you can judge, is not an autobiography. I thought that it would divert attention from the story that I felt needed to be told, and probably would not be told by anybody else, and maybe it would have gone untold unless I wrote this book, if I were to stretch it all the way from the time and place where I was born until the present time. So maybe I'll just say a few words about my biography, the pieces and parts that do not appear with any prominence in the book. I went to Israel in 1948 from the United States. Quite frequently, people in the United States will ask me, how is it that you went to Israel in 1948? And I'm a little hesitant to respond with what naturally comes to my mind. I would say, how is it that you did go to Israel in 1948? Because to me, at that time, it seemed like the only thing to do. An obligation that I, as a young Jew at the time, felt I had. I had the feeling at the time, and I think correctly so, in a historical perspective, that the Jewish people, 3 years after the full dimensions of the Holocaust had become apparent, were fighting for their lives. That maybe this was really our last battle for survival. And I thought every Jew that could contribute in any manner or measure to victory in that battle had to do his part. I afterwards returned to my profession. I was an aeronautical engineer. I taught at the Technion in the Department of Aeronautical Engineering that was founded at the time under the inspiration of David Ben-Gurion, who was Prime Minister and Defense Minister at the time. I never dreamt in my wildest dreams that I would ever end up being Israel's Defense Minister and hold the office that he held. It was a great period for me, teaching at the Technion, then going on to become the chief engineer of Israel Aircraft Industries, which was no more than a garage when I first started there in 1982 that did minor modifications of aircraft. And that within a number of years became one of the great aerospace industries of the world, created, developed by these young graduates of the Department of Aeronautical Engineering of the Technion. And it was only after I left Israel Aircraft Industries in 1971 that I went into business, had a little more time, a little more money, and in a moment of weakness allowed myself to be talked into going to politics and running for the Knesset, thinking that maybe I would contribute 4 years or part of my time during 4 years on the political scene, do what I could for my country as a politician. But the 4 years stretched out to be 18 years, and the last 4 years of those 18 years are recorded in the book that you have before you. There were, I think, important years in Israel's history, and they included 4 specific developments, events, if you like. One, the Intifada. I inherited the Intifada from my predecessor at the Ministry of Defense, Yitzhak Rabin. We changed posts twice, a very unusual occurrence anywhere and unprecedented in Israel. He took over the defense ministry from me in 1984 after my first tenure as defense minister, and then again in 1992 after Labour won the elections, and I turned the defense ministry over to him. The Intifada broke out during the time that he was defense minister. When I became foreign minister after the Likud election victory in 1988, it was going strong. It was causing Israel a great deal of damage. Rabin used to say, and I agreed and repeated that it was not endangering the very existence of the State of Israel. It wasn't like the Yom Kippur War. But we knew that it had the seeds of causing Israel a great deal of damage, which in the long run might create dangers that maybe we couldn't even fully conceive. But when I entered the foreign ministry, I realized that Israel was becoming increasingly isolated, coming under attack and pressure, not only from those who had never been friends of Israel, but also from friends of Israel, from members of the Jewish community. There was considerable concern and dissension in Israel itself, and it was a phenomenon that had to be addressed. I point out in the book that I think it was a very grave mistake on the part of Israeli governments, mostly Labour, but eventually also Likud, that over the years since 1967, when Judea, Samaria, and Gaza came under Israeli control, the Palestinian population was in effect ignored. There was no Israeli policy towards the Palestinian problem. It was a non-policy. It was a non-policy that was originally enunciated by Moshe Dayan, who was defense minister during the Six-Day War and for many years thereafter, which in effect said that Israel was waiting for a telephone call from King Hussein. There was some specious logic in the saying. Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, had been annexed by Jordan in 1948 after Jordan participated in the attack on Israel in 1948. The Palestinian population, in those days it was called the Arab population of the area, had received Jordanian citizenship, and so Dayan said, and that policy was then followed by successive Israeli governments. When and if King Hussein came to the peace table, that would be the time to address and negotiate the status of the territories and of the people living in the territories. But the gap between King Hussein and Jordan and the Palestinian population became increasingly wide over the years, and the feeling of frustration that their problems, their aspirations were not being addressed, the very difficult economic situation that prevailed in these areas, especially in Gaza, certainly in retrospect we can say inevitably brought about the massive civil disturbances that characterized the Intifada. I had to deal with that directly when I became defense minister after the National Unity government broke up in 1990, when I took over from Yitzhak Rabin. And I'm a little hesitant in giving myself compliments, but in effect the Intifada was almost finished by the time of the elections of 1992. There were no more massive disturbances. There was hardly any more publicity given to the Intifada. You didn't see it on the television screens anymore. It had run out of steam, mainly because it had been a period of great suffering and great difficulty for the Palestinian population, but also because we had, I think, sent a clear message to them that Israel was not going to give in to violence and that nothing was going to be achieved by rock throwing. And by the time I left the Defense Ministry in 1992, we had essentially restored normal life to the territories. I had opened all of the schools, all of the universities. The PLO, in effect, was in many ways finished, run out of steam, and that, I suppose, is the explanation. And that's the explanation given by many for the reason that Arafat was ready to make the agreement with Yitzhak Rabin when the Rabin government indicated its readiness to make an agreement with the PLO. They didn't seem to have any alternative anymore. But new life was being breathed into them at a moment when they were essentially finished. As foreign minister, I authored the Israeli Peace Initiative of May 1989. In May 1989, it was adopted by the National Unity Government, in which Peres and Rabin were members. And I did my level best to get this initiative formulated and adopted by the Israeli government, because I was convinced, as I came to the foreign ministry, that it was essential for Israel to take an initiative and to show that we were not just stonewalling and not just resigning ourselves to the status quo, but that we were interested in moving the diplomatic process along, in proving to the world that if no progress was made, if no progress were to be made, it would not be because of lack of trying on our part. The peace initiative included 4 points specifically. You'll find in the book that I originally suggested 5 points, but Rabin vetoed one of them. He was defense minister at the time. And the 4 points were, one, a reconfirmation of the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty, consultations between Israel and Egypt and the United States, which was a signatory to the Camp David Accords, 2, direct negotiations between Israel and those Arab countries that insisted that they were in a state of war with Israel, 3, negotiations between Israel and democratically elected representatives of the Palestinian population in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, and 4, an international effort to relieve the plight of the Palestinian refugees in the refugee camps. Some of those points are in the process of implementation. The initiative led eventually, after the Gulf War, to the Madrid Conference. The Madrid Conference led to direct negotiations between Israel and Palestinians, Israel and Jordanians, Israel and Syrians, Israel and Lebanese. Not all these negotiations have produced concrete results, at least not so far. Elections amongst the Palestinian population were never held. I think that was a very bad mistake, and the negotiations that eventually brought about an agreement, which in my view is a sad mistake, were held with Yasser Arafat and the PLO, and not with people that were elected by or had a mandate from the population living in the area. The third major event during the 4-year period was the Gulf War, a 6-week war for Israel, a very unusual and in some ways traumatic war for Israel. Again, Israel's existence was never really in danger, although we were not quite sure of that at certain periods. We knew that Saddam Hussein had chemical weapons. We knew that he had missiles that hit Israel, and Iraqi missiles did hit Israel. 39 of them landed in Israel. We had to do something that had not been done anywhere in the world since World War II. I, as defense minister, issue gas masks to every man, woman, child, and baby in Israel in anticipation that we might be hit by Scud missiles with chemical warheads. And we found that even though it was no accident that Saddam Hussein, who was a sworn enemy of Israel and threatened Israel with destruction and threatened Israel with the use of chemical warfare, but for a certain period of time, in my view an aberration, was supported by the administration in Washington, was given amongst other things what the administration refused to give to Shamir's government, namely loan guarantees, which were not used for their presumed purpose of buying agricultural produce, but rather were used for weaponry. It was no accident that this man, who was an enemy of Israel, also turned out to be an enemy of the United States. I think that that was inevitable. But as it turned out, and I wrote about it in the book, the enemy of our enemy did not turn out to be our friend. And the Israeli-U.S. relationship during that period as well, or maybe especially during that period, was not really the kind of relationship that you would expect to have occur between two allies at war against a common enemy. The 4-year period in terms of the U.S.-Israeli relationship, which was really one very unique between two countries very far apart, in many ways very different. Israel, one of the smallest countries.
Well, that's Moshe Ahrens when he's being more candid. He's now, of course, once again, the defense minister of Israel. The most important thing he's really done, however, is bring the world Bibi Netanyahu, because it was Moshe Ahrens who made Netanyahu a protege of his and launched his political career. Now, those of you who watch Mideast Realities, and if you've been to our website, which we urge you to do at www.middleeast.org, you know, of course, that our views are rather different than those of Moshe Ahrens. But it's very important to understand where these people are coming from, what their ideology is, what their perspective on events is. And this talk that Moshe Ahrens gave when he thought his political career was over is more candid and more illuminating than the kinds of talks he gives now when he's holding political power and with the Israeli elections looming. One of the more interesting things about Moshe Ahrens is his own family. His brother Richard, who is now deceased, vehemently opposed everything that Moshe Ahrens stood for and was arguing loudly for a Palestinian state long before it became popular to talk about it. And as a defense minister, it's also ironic and interesting that his son, Yigal, is essentially a draft evader. Yigal Ahrens left Israel rather than serve in the Israeli military. There was a period of time when he was looking for whatever excuses people look for, whatever medical conditions people look for, in order to be able to essentially evade the draft. And even today, there are ramifications. His visits to Israel have to be pre-approved, otherwise he'd run into legal and military problems. Interestingly also, Yigal holds views very different than his father and has argued, in fact, very strongly for a major reduction in American support for Israel. We have a couple of clips from an interview of Yigal Ahrens a number of years ago, and we're going to show one of those to you right now.
The fact that the U.S. has been giving aid to Israel, and in such substantial amounts, has been affecting Israeli policy. Supporters of Israel try to claim now that if the U.S. threatens the withdrawal of aid if Israel doesn't do something like halt settlements in the occupied territories, that's impermissible interference in internal Israeli policy decisions. By implication, claiming that the continued flow of aid does not constitute any kind of interference. I think that's wrong, and it couldn't be more wrong. Nothing could be more wrong than that. The fact that the Israelis have been getting such large amounts of aid until now allows the Israeli government to pursue policies that otherwise the population probably would have opposed, or opposed more strongly than it does. The settlements in the occupied territory, continued occupation, these are very costly policies. And if the Israelis had to pay, if the Israeli citizens had to pay the true cost of these policies, I suspect that they would have opposed them in greater numbers than they oppose them now. The U.S. has been funding these policies for a long time, and therefore it hasn't already been influencing the Israeli politics, and all we're calling for now is that the influence be in a more positive direction, in our point of view. Actually, if you think about it in these terms, then perhaps withdrawal of aid would be the way to really not influence Israeli policy, to allow the Israelis to live with the consequences of what they're doing, which I believe would cause them to change their line.
Do you know?
Well, Yigal Ahrens is essentially right. The United States has been underwriting and financing Israeli policies for a very long time and is quite complicitous in what has happened in the region. Next week, we'll continue with Moshe Ahrens. As I mentioned, he gave this talk when he thought his political career was over, when he could be much more candid than he has been when he holds office. And we thank you very much for tuning into our program, Mideast Realities. We try very hard to bring you a perspective that isn't available through the normal establishment media, which is very much influenced by establishment political interests and by financial interests. The Israeli-American relationship is an extremely close and important one. The situation in the Middle East remains extremely unstable and volatile. And that's the reason we bring you this program, and that's the reason we have Mideast Realities on the internet at middleeast.org. Please do take a look, and please tune in next week again for Mideast Realities.